to our hybrid in-person and virtual event tonight. And so I know that you all could have been anywhere else on a Wednesday evening, and you chose to be with us. And so we're very, very excited to have you here for our annual Anne Braden Institute lecture. And as many people are who are here with us, we also have a large virtual audience of people who are coming on to Teams to join us. And so we had nearly 500 people who were registered tonight. 100 and something of you said you'd be here tonight, and another 300 and something online. So we're excited to have such a big crowd with us today. If y'all wouldn't mind just waving at the folks online so they can see you, feel like they're part of the family, and they're in the room tonight. I am Dr. Brandon McCormick, Associate Professor of Pan-African Studies and Comparative Humanities, and now have the new role as Director of the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research. And thank you all. It's a new position that both humbles and excites me. It humbles me because of the footsteps that I follow in, not the least of which is the founding director, Dr. Kate Fossil, who was also an Anne Braden biographer who worked tirelessly to establish the Anne Braden Institute over the last 16 years, as well as the late Dr. J. Blaine Hudson, who was a beloved member of our faculty in Pan-African Studies and the Dean of Arts and Sciences here, who helped Dr. Fossil to co-found the Anne Braden Institute, as well as the activist and organizer and more than an ally, a radical white woman of the South and subversive Southerner, Anne Braden herself, as well as all of the activists and organizers and everyday people who have worked for social justice on our campus and in our community and across the nation. Those are big shoes to fill, and so it humbles me to be in this position. But it also excites me at the same time because there's a lot of work to do when we talk about the work that we need to do for social and racial justice. But I've been so excited and encouraged by all of the support that so many of you have given me and reached out and said that you were supporting my directorship, that you wanted to figure out how we could collaborate, how we could work together. And there's a lot of brilliant minds out here on this campus who have reached out to me, and I can't wait to work with you collaboratively and creatively on some projects going down the road. And so I'm very excited about the anti-racist work that we have to do on this campus, in the community, and across the country. But my task really is this evening just to welcome you here tonight, and then to sit back and to enjoy the lecture. And so let me welcome you again to the 15th annual Anne Braden Memorial Lecture. We've had a litany of very powerful and prolific speakers over the years, from our inaugural lecturer, the late Julian Bond, to Professor Robin D.G. Kelly, to the inimitable Angela Davis, to Dr. Keeanga Yamata Taylor. And I am very excited that we will add to that list of eminent speakers tonight. When I first accepted this position, it was in late July, and we knew we were already behind the curve, and we need to find a lecturer soon. And so it was my first task to find a lecturer, and I knew that with all that had happened, with the racial reckonings that had happened over the summer in response to Ahmaud Arbery and of George Floyd, and in this city, the botched police raid that stole the life of our beloved Breonna Taylor. And I knew that so many of our students and our staff and our faculty member had been out in the streets protesting and fighting for justice all summer 2020 long, and coming back in during a pandemic. And this will be one of the first times that we would have to gather together on campus for an in-person lecture. And so the first email that I sent was to Dr. Elizabeth Hinton, who had just recently released the book, America on Fire: The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Now, I didn't know Dr. Hinton, she didn't know me, so I just said a little prayer to God. God, please let her say yes to me. She's all the way up at Yale, and I'm down here at Louisville, and if you like me, God, just let her say yes. And she responded quickly, saying that she was very excited about the invitation, but apologized that due to prior family engagement, she would not be able to make it. But she really wanted to be here. Could we do it in the spring? And I was like, well, I'm the new director. I can't really move the lecture to the spring. We got to have something in the fall. And this is an urgent topic right now. We need somebody who could speak to this right now. And then I remembered we had had a very successful inaugural Juneteenth lecture here in this very same room. That was a hybrid event that we had Dr. Melissa Harris Perry, who zoomed in to talk to us, to a gathered audience. And I asked if she would be willing to engage us in that manner. And she graciously accepted, and we could not be more excited to have Dr. Elizabeth Hinton from Yale University be our 15th annual Anne Braden Lecturer. And so with that, I want to invite Flora Schildknecht to join me on the stage to formally introduce Dr. Hinton. And as she's coming, I just want to say that Flora is one of our 3 fabulous GTAs who work with the ABI this year. We simply could not have done the work that we've done this semester in this time of transition and pulling this lecture off tonight without the work of our GTAs. And that is Flora, who is a doctoral student in comparative humanities. That is Barbie Johns here on the front row. Say hi, Barbie, who is a doctoral student in Pan-African Studies. And it is also Ben Harlan, who is in the back, who is a master's student in the Department of Anthropology. So please, please join me in giving a hand to these doctoral and graduate students who have worked so hard to make sure that this night would be a success. And with that, I just want to turn the mic over to Flora Schildknecht, doctoral student in comparative humanities, to introduce Dr. Hinton. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. McCormack. Dr. Elizabeth Hinton is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Department of African American Studies at Yale, with a secondary appointment as Professor of Law in the law school. Before joining the Yale faculty, Hinton was a professor in the Department of History and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States, and she's one of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing. Her articles and op-eds can be found in the pages of the Journal of American History, the Journal of Urban History, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Boston Review, the Nation, and Time, and Hinton's award-winning book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, was published in 2016 by Harvard University Press. Her new book, published this year by Liverite, is titled America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. The Kirkus Review hails America on Fire as, quote, a must-read for all concerned with civil rights and social justice in modern America. The Washington Post states, not since Angela Davis's 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete, has a scholar so persuasively challenged our conventional understanding of the criminal legal system. And in praise of Dr. Hinton's new book, the New York Times Book Review has this to say. America on Fire is more than a brilliant guided tour through our nation's morally ruinous past. It reveals the deep roots of the current movement to reject a system of law enforcement that defines as the problem the very people who continue to seek to liberate themselves from racial oppression. In undertaking this work, Hinton achieves something rare. She deploys scholarly erudition in the service of policy transformation, propelled by Black voices whose hitherto untold stories of protest add much needed sustenance to America's collective imagination. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Hinton.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Flora. I assume everybody can hear me, because if you can't, somebody would be waving their arms. To Dr. McCormick for inviting me to deliver this lecture and for being so flexible to make it happen. I am so completely thrilled to be here and appreciate you and the Anne Braden Institute for hosting. Dean Edwards, I'm also really looking forward to being in conversation with you, and to everyone for coming, both in the ballroom and those of you out there virtually. It really is such an incredible honor to have the opportunity to deliver this lecture, especially in part of the esteemed lineup of speakers each of whom I deeply admire. So as those of you in Louisville perhaps know better than anyone, during the summer of 2020, Americans witnessed what is perhaps the largest mass protest movement in American history, sparked, of course, as Dr. McCormick laid out, and I hope that you can see, okay, by the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in 2020, as well as that of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor by Louisville police officers, and 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery by a white father and son in southern Georgia. And of course, their trial is currently unfolding. Between 15 and 26 million people protested anti-Black racism and police violence in all 50 states in some 4,444 cities across the planet. Louisville's protest was the longest and most sustained. The demonstrations began on the evening of May 28th, 3 days after George Floyd was murdered, when people took to the streets demanding justice for Taylor, demanding that the officers who stormed into her apartment be criminally charged, and shouting, "No justice, no peace, prosecute police." These peaceful demonstrations were met with tear gas and pepper balls detonated by the police. 7 civilians were shot by gunfire, with 2 suffering major injuries. As the protests continued, Mayor Greg Fisher implemented a dusk till dawn curfew and sent in the National Guard. On June 1st, the 4th night of protests, 53-year-old David McAddy, the owner of a popular barbecue stand, was fatally shot by the National Guard during a scuffle between law enforcement and a crowd of protesters on 26th and Broadway. On June 5th, a crowd of at least 1,000 people gathered on what would have been Taylor's 27th birthday to celebrate her life. The massive demonstrations that day enveloped Metro Hall downtown and culminated with protest marches around the city. By August, there had been 75 days of protests in Louisville, leading to the arrests of 500 participants. In total, during the summer of 2020, and despite the fact that the vast majority, or about 96% of the protests remained entirely peaceful, more than 17,000 National Guardsmen patrolled the protests in American cities in 23 states and Washington, D.C. Louisville and the nation had not seen a wave of urban violence like this since the long, hot summers of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Between 1964 and 1972, the United States confronted the greatest moment of sustained domestic violence since the Civil War, and clearly we've been living in the aftershocks of this period since. Every major urban center burned during these 8 years, but the violence was not just a problem in archetypal ghettos like Harlem and Watts, and in majority Black cities like Detroit and Washington, D.C. It could happen in any place where Black residents were denied access to political and economic resources and lived in segregated, unequal conditions. Together, these events caused hundreds of millions of dollars of property damage and shaped the lives of the store owners who found their businesses destroyed, the parents who lost their teenage son to riot police, the firefighters and cops who were harmed or killed, and millions of other Americans in between. Through the rhetoric of our politicians, media coverage, and much of the academic research on the subject, we've become accustomed to refer to these events, from Harlem in '64 to Louisville in our own time, as riots, or what those left of center sometimes refer to as civil disorders. We are then left to view these moments in a historical vacuum as riots, as something meaningless or irrational, devoid of any political motivation, and ultimately criminal. This is a position from which the Trump administration responded to the violence of 2020 and how President Lyndon B. Johnson responded from its inception. Johnson announced, following the release of an FBI report on the violence that swept 8 cities during the summer of 1964, quote, "The riots, as well as other criminal and juvenile delinquency problems in our cities, are closely connected. Each riot began with a single incident and was aggravated by hoodlums and habitual lawbreakers." Johnson dismissed the possibility that these hoodlums shared many of the same grievances as civil rights protesters. 3 years later, Johnson would tell the nation during a televised address delivered in the middle of the unprecedented violence in Detroit in July 1967, "There is no American right to loot stores or to burn buildings or to fire rifles from rooftops. That is crime." Before this point, riots in the United States had been mostly perpetrated by white vigilante mobs who were hostile to integration and who took justice into their own hands, often with the support of local police. A riotous lynch mob as large as 5,000, many of whom came from out of town, descended on the Black community of Springfield, Illinois in August 1908, randomly destroying Black businesses, driving Black families from their homes, and executing 2 Black men. Mobs in East St. Louis in 1917 made Black wartime factory workers and their families choose between being burned alive or shot to death, among other acts of terrorism, in one of the bloodiest riots of the 20th century. This white supremacist violence only escalated as Black migrants continued to flee the terror of the segregationist South in greater numbers during and after World War I, searching for better opportunities and safety from the white mob. 25 cities erupted during the Red Summer of 1919 when white and Black residents fought and killed each other on the streets of Chicago and Washington, D.C. In the rural community of Phillips County, Arkansas, where Black tenant sharecroppers were attempting to unionize, white emergency posses killed at least 200 Black people. Another 200 would be killed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 2 years later, in what is known as the Greenwood Massacre, carried out by 2,000 white men who were deputized to commit various atrocities against Black residents with the full backing of the county government. In fact, we just commemorated the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre last May. And race riots, as they were called, spiked again in major cities during World War II. White supremacist violence continues to pervade American society. Indeed, it fully revealed itself on January 6th, although in the post-war period, local police came to assume many of the previous functions of the white mob. When white people no longer appeared to be the driving force behind rioting in the nation's cities and Black collective violence against exploitative and exclusionary institutions surfaced, rioting became associated with criminality and grounded the intensifying clamor for law and order. As President Johnson and others saw it, rioting and crime were 2 strains of the same pathology in Black communities that could only be cured by more police. It was the riffraff of the ghetto who fueled the violence, so this theory went. The criminals, the young, the unskilled, the jobless. They rioted, they burned and looted, seeking momentary thrills to break their tedious lives. Such pathological understandings, never a frame through which authorities considered acts of white terrorism, reinforced a general sense of disorder in urban centers and justified lawmakers' decision to enlist the police to manage that disorder. Johnson called the war on crime in 1965, beginning an unprecedented investment into local law enforcement that was prompted in large part by the problem of Black rebellion. As Americans fought the Vietnam War, federal policymakers ramped up police operations on the home front to battle political radicalism and rebellion, creating a pipeline to deliver surplus armies and technologies to local law enforcement. City officials took advantage of this freshly available federal resource to control Black neighborhoods. The federal allocation for local police forces went from nothing in 1964 to $10 million in 1965, $20.6 million in 1966, $63 million in 1968, $100 million in 1969, and $300 million in 1970. That's a 3,000% increase in police funding in 5 years. On the ground, this translated to programs that modernized police departments with riot control training and military-grade weapons like AR-15s and M4 carbines, helicopters, steel helmets, 3-foot batons, masks, armored vehicles, 2-way radios, tear gas, and a handful of low-cost police community relation measures thrown in for good measure. Although Black communities had been vulnerable to targeted surveillance, frequent encounters with police, mass arrests, illegal searches, and outright brutality in the century after emancipation, the launch of the war on crime meant that Black residents in cities across the United States, large and small, would be patrolled by police departments with an arsenal of riot control equipment at their disposal. With the war on crime came new forms of social control and with them a new form of resistance. A proper account of the violence in the post-civil rights era depends on our ability to interpret it not as a wave of criminality, as did Johnson and other officials at all levels of government, but as a period of sustained insurgency. The violence emerged in response to a moment of tangibly felt racism, a single incident, as Johnson said, most often touched off by a police encounter. But the tens of thousands of Black Americans who participated in this collective violence were rebelling against past harms, past wrongs, and systems that had preserved unequal conditions over generations. The rebellions appeared most threatening in the summer of 1967 and in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. Our memory of these incidents largely stops there, but the rebellions endured for years to come. In fact, between May 1968 and December 1972, residents of at least 960 Black communities across the United States witnessed 1,949 separate uprisings. Through these 4 years, nearly 40,000 people were arrested, more than 10,000 were injured, and at least 220 people died. 1967 was only a prelude. Louisville figures prominently in this largely forgotten history of the rebellions of this later period. From May 27th through May 30th, 1968, exactly 52 years to the day of the initial Breonna Taylor protests in Louisville, the city erupted in 4 nights of rebellion. Residents engaged in violent confrontations with police, burned buildings and cars, and plundered stores, causing about $200,000 in property damage. 2 Black teenagers were shot and killed, 2 others were seriously shot, and 1 person was stabbed. Black residents in Louisville and in thousands of communities across the United States were fighting back against more than just the police officers who interrupted them or brutalized them as they went about their daily lives. Although the tactics may have differed, the people who attacked police, smashed windows, set fires, and plundered local stores shared the same demands as the mainstream civil rights movement. They were fighting against the process of their own criminalization, as well as making unanswered calls for socioeconomic inclusion and against racism more broadly. Most of the violent encounters involving Black residents during this period began in response to the policing of ordinary everyday activity. They happened when police broke up community gatherings or when police intervened in matters that could be resolved internally, like disputes among friends and family. They happened when police enforced laws that would almost certainly never be applied in white neighborhoods, like gathering in groups of a certain size or acting like a suspicious person. And likewise, they happened when police failed to extend to residents of color the common courtesies afforded to whites, like allowing white teenagers to drink in a park, but arresting Black teens for the same behavior. If they would just leave us alone, there would be no trouble, said a Black teenage boy who threw rocks in Decatur, Illinois during an uprising in August 1969. His solution was a straightforward reaction to an obvious issue. Rebellion was always possible when ordinary life was policed and policed violently, and often the mere sight of police who could potentially arrest, beat, or even kill you was enough to prompt a violent response. Multiple occasions of seemingly arbitrary or unnecessarily aggressive police interventions accumulated into frustration and set off preemptive violent reactions. So this is what I call the cycle, the recurring pattern of over-policing and rebellion, of police violence and community violence that helped define urban life in segregated low-income communities of color in the late 60s and 1970s, helping entrench racial inequality and putting this nation on the path to mass incarceration. While every rebellion had its particular actors and causes, what is remarkable is the broad similarity between them. In Louisville in 1968, the cycle was set in motion much like more recent uprisings in 2020, during a peaceful rally demanding greater accountability for police brutality. Weeks before the violence began in mid-May, the U.S. Supreme Court had refused to review the dismissal of a lawsuit filed by prominent civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael and 10 other people who charged that during peaceful civil rights demonstrations, Louisville police made a series of unconstitutional arrests on charges of disorderly conduct and loitering in order to keep Black people from exercising their First Amendment rights. Adding fuel to the resentment of much of Louisville's Black community over the Supreme Court's refusal to even consider the matter, a white policeman named Michael Clifford was accused of having used excessive force in arresting a Black real estate broker and a Black school teacher. And although the mainstream press often blamed the young hoodlums in Louisville for the violence, the Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, recounted the series of police abuses leading up to the rebellion, not only asking if the cops themselves were responsible on the front page of the paper, but also with the cartoon that you see implicating the FBI and the CIA in King's murder. The Louisville NAACP and the Kentucky Christian Leadership Conference demanded Clifford's firing, and the police department suspended him for a 15-day period. When the Louisville Civil Service Board reinstated Clifford, civil rights leaders held a rally at the intersection of 28th and Greenwood Streets in the Parkland neighborhood of the majority Black West End of the city on Monday, May 27th. This spot was located in one of the area's commercial and entertainment hubs with record stores, pool halls, and the local NAACP branch headquarters located there. The purpose of the rally was to call on Mayor Kenneth A. Schmid to uphold the police department's decision to fire Clifford. "We're not going to take this anymore. We're going to act and act together," speakers announced before a crowd of about 400 people. Stokely Carmichael himself had been scheduled to deliver the keynote, but one of his lieutenants, a SNCC activist from Washington named James Cortez, informed the attendees that the honkies, as he said, had prevented Carmichael from attending by refusing to allow his flight to land in Louisville, a charge airline officials later denied. Angered by this news, people started throwing bottles. The police moved in on the crowd, which only inflamed protesters even more. Eyewitness accounts differ on how exactly the rebellion started, but according to the Louisville Courier-Journal, a young person threw a bottle at police who were attempting to disperse the crowd, leading officers to draw their weapons. Far from suppressing the violence, the display of police force had the opposite effect. The bottle throwing continued, and a police captain was hit in the face. It was a losing battle for the outnumbered officers on the scene, and they were forced to retreat to wait for reinforcements. When law enforcement left the area, if only temporarily, the crowd grew, setting fire to and overturning a police patrol car that had been left behind. When reinforcements arrived, the volleys of bottles and rocks increased. Bullets were fired, either by police or residents or both. The crowd grew in size, and the cops started chasing people they saw throwing objects, hitting them with their billy clubs. The cycle of police abuse and rebellion spread from there, and the violence escalated on both sides. Some residents continued to throw stones and bottles on police, firemen, and taxis, while bands of 20 to 50 Negro youths, as the press described them, turned on local businesses and other buildings, breaking windows and taking food, clothes, tires, and stereos from several stores and setting more cars to fires in buildings. As the violence and property destruction continued to spread throughout the city, the entire police force was placed on emergency duty. Mayor Schmid instated a dusk to dawn curfew, and the governor summoned more than 600 Kentucky National Guardsmen from Louisville to the scene, who took to the streets with M14 rifles. By 2 a.m. early Tuesday morning, calm had been restored for the evening. Although Louisville was known for its relatively progressive stance on civil rights, at the time, the conditions in the city's West End clearly resembled that of Harlem, Watts, Detroit, and many other low-income Black communities across the United States that had also erupted. Approximately 50,000 of the 86,000 Black residents in Louisville, who together represented about 20% of the city's population, lived in the 20 square block area in the West End where the rebellion occurred. When white families began to leave the district for the working class South End or the more affluent East End in the 1950s, Black families assumed the 1 to 2 story homes with porch fronts and peaked roofs they left behind. Muhammad Ali's childhood home pictured here reflects a typical home in the area at the time. As the West End transformed from a predominantly white to a predominantly Black community in the post-war period, conditions began to deteriorate. Urban renewal projects that began in the mid-1960s destroyed hundreds of homes that were beyond redemption. Black residents were essentially limited to segregated projects like the Cotter homes, where the housing authority was unresponsive or often insensitive, or to the oldest housing stock in the city, where slum landlords, who were very rarely subject to housing inspections, allowed the dwellings to deteriorate further while charging exorbitant rent prices. Within the slum properties, the floors were often sagging and rotten, with plaster crumbling on the walls. Many bathrooms were simply boxed-in porches. Floors tended to slant incorrectly so that the water in the tub ran away from the drain. Toilets could be found sinking through the floors. Adding to the desperate conditions Black Louisville residents confronted, they suffered a rate of unemployment that was more than 3 times that of their white counterparts, and those with jobs were often in the lowest paying, unskilled sector. As a result, roughly a quarter of Black residents in Louisville lived below the poverty line, more than double the rate of white households in the city. And the public schools, which had been flagged as racially imbalanced for the segregation within them, were under-resourced and as a result, underperforming. As a Black teenager named Freddie Butcher described the conditions in the impoverished West End, they've, meaning the white establishment of Louisville, got their little government reservation here. Butcher was part of a rising generation that had witnessed the civil rights movement unfold during their childhoods and were now coming of age in the era of Black power. The death of Martin Luther King, 1 month before the violence broke out in Louisville, marked a turning point for the mainstream civil rights movement and its emphasis on nonviolence, a strategy that had failed to protect its most visible proponent from the violent forces of racism and seemed to many incapable of securing true freedom for Black Americans. Up to this point, Black residents in Louisville and their white allies had engaged in a number of nonviolent direct action struggles to create a more equitable city. 1 year before the rebellion, local activists launched a sustained campaign demanding legislation to make it illegal to refuse to sell or rent property to an individual based on their race. Led by Martin Luther King's brother, the Reverend A.D. Williams King, hundreds of people marched to the homes of local aldermen on a nightly basis for months on end in order to pressure for change. The movement also involved civil rights and labor activist Anne Braden, for whom this lecture and the Institute are named, and who Dr. McCormack spoke of so eloquently in his opening remarks, who made national headlines after purchasing a home in an all-white neighborhood for a Black family that had been previously denied the right to buy there. Later, Braden herself was rounded up and arrested with hundreds of other protesters during the open housing struggle. Mayor Schmid passed a number of ordinances to make it easier for police to arrest the demonstrators, and hundreds were thrown in jail. So whether nonviolent or violent, the police were prepared to repress any protest against racist conditions. After months of organizing seemed to produce little effect other than a crackdown against the movement by law enforcement, Williams and other leaders decided to shut down the Kentucky Derby to give the open housing movement leverage. But rather than negotiate with King and other leaders, Mayor Schmid asked the governor to send in the National Guard, and the Ku Klux Klan announced it would attend the race in force. So the day before the Kentucky Derby, Martin Luther King, who had come to Louisville to assist his brother with the protests, appeared before a crowd of several hundred and announced that the community would not make an effort to disrupt the Derby. The 1967 Derby proceeded without incident, but the decision not to disrupt the events brought the King brothers and the open housing movement no goodwill from authorities. Local leaders refused to negotiate, and the discriminatory housing ordinance went unchanged. As Butcher and his generation saw, the nonviolent direct action protests of the open housing campaign and the civil rights movement at large, the sit-ins, marches, boycotts, voter registration drives, and legal challenges that defined Black politics in the post-war period had not addressed structural inequalities or provided protection from the lived realities of police and white supremacist violence. Well, the civil rights movement made racism no longer acceptable in American public discourse and created a Black middle class, as well as the right to an education, to shop at certain stores or eat in certain restaurants, and to vote. At the end of the 1960s, the young people rebelling understood their predecessors to have failed. They looked back on the heyday of the civil rights movement, and they looked at the conditions they were currently living in, with police watching them from the other side of the park, and they rebelled. Indeed, political violence from Louisville to Philadelphia to Waterloo, Iowa to Stockton, California, and everywhere in between was the most widely adopted form of protest among young Black people from King's assassination through the early 1970s. It can be a struggle to imagine the young people who threw rocks at police or who looted local businesses as political actors, and this bias has influenced the writing of history. Even scholars and activists interested in forms of resistance to systemic racism have been reluctant to take seriously the political nature of Black rebellion. Yet just as much as nonviolent direct action, rebellion presented a way for people of color to express collective solidarity in the face of exploitation, political exclusion, and criminalization. And arguably, the success of the nonviolent direct political action that characterized the civil rights movement depended on the presence of violent direct political action. As Martin Luther King Jr. himself recognized, the power of mass nonviolence arose in part from its ability to suggest the coercive power of violent resistance should demands not be met. Therefore, when we reflect on Black protests, past, present, and future, we should endeavor to see both its violent and nonviolent expressions as entwined forces. And to do that, we should attempt to understand violent rebellion on its own terms as a form of protest that has been just as integral to the history of the United States and freedom movements. And so, like their counterparts across the United States during this period, when all the other options for political and economic equality had seemed to be exhausted, Black residents in Louisville continued to set fires through the West End area, despite a heavy contingent of National Guardsmen and police on the scene. Some taunted the Guardsmen only to be arrested and charged with breach of the peace. As the cycle of rebellion unfolded in Louisville over several days and nights, the scale of destruction increased as the numbers of law enforcement authorities increased, and with them more violence and more arrests. In Louisville and other cities, the cycle could be ended through police action, whether overbearing or shrewdly de-escalatory. It could end when the crowd expended energy, and it could also be ended by ministers, community leaders, and radical activists who often acted as important intermediaries between participants and police. The Reverend A.D. William King and other community leaders walked the streets trying to break up groups of young people who gathered along the lines established by the National Guard, encouraging them to go home. These efforts were just as, if not more, successful in restoring peace and preventing injury. The police wanted to enforce the law and restore order, and the community peacekeepers wanted everyone to be safe. Working with Mayor Schmid, King and other leaders negotiated an agreement for the National Guard to remain on the perimeter of the riot area, except to provide extra assistance to firemen and police when necessary. The worst of the violence happened on the fourth and final night, Thursday, May 30th. By then, there were 2,000 National Guardsmen on the scene, with the looting and fire still raging. In order to keep resentment from continuing to spread, Police Chief C.L. Clyde instructed officers to display a massive show of force while still exercising the utmost restraint, but using, quote, whatever degree of force is necessary to arrest observed looters. The police used wide discretion in determining the necessary degree of force, as they so often do. In the early morning hours of May 30th, 14-year-old James Groves was fatally shot while allegedly looting a store. 2 other young Black people, the newspapers didn't report their names or ages, were shot and hospitalized. In one of the instances, the police claimed they saw a young Black male running and shot him, but community witnesses told a different story. A Black teenage girl named Ira Cordelia Coden explained to a reporter, quote, they shot him in the legs. He wasn't looting. He was just watching. He got scared when a police car came and he ran and they shot him. A handful of other witnesses corroborated Coden's story. He was running and they shot him, said an adult male bystander. He wasn't even in front of the store. He was just watching. You know how kids are. He panicked and ran. During the rebellion in Louisville and other cities, police often believed their own lives were in greater danger than before and felt they had license to act without regard to the law or human rights. Police usually claimed they were acting in their own self-defense by preventing people from looting, as if protecting property is more important than human life. But in many cases, they randomly or even wildly fired their weapons, killing or injuring Black people who were not involved in the rebellion, like the young boy who was shot in the legs when he simply ran from police. These violent exchanges also extended to white civilians. Shortly after police killed James Groves, 62-year-old white liquor store owner named William Berger shot and killed a Black 19-year-old named Matthias Broder. Berger told authorities he had been locking up his store for the night when a group of Black teenagers broke his windows and began taking goods. Berger claimed he fired into the crowd of young people indiscriminately, did not know whose bullets had struck anyone until he came outside and saw Broder bleeding and dying on the sidewalk. No charges were brought against Berger or the officers who shot Groves and the other 2 young Black residents. In the face of the killings of James Groves, Matthias Broder, and the injuries sustained by a handful of others, Mayor Schmid proclaimed could have been a lot worse. The aftermath of a cycle of violence and rebellion varied greatly from situation to situation and depended largely on how local authorities responded to Black demands. Even if law enforcement officials tended to pathologize rebellion by labeling participants hoodlums and attributing the violence to a bunch of troublemakers or outside influences, many city officials and journalists tried to identify deeper causes. In Louisville, participants and residents consistently stressed that policing strategies in general and the way officers treated youth of color in particular set off the rebellions. Police were having fun, Freddie Butcher reflected of the attitude he observed among law enforcement during the rebellion. They had a field day on Negroes. He used different, but I'm not going to repeat that here. But the underlying issues that caused the rebellion extended far beyond policing and Officer Clifford's reinstatement. Sam Hawkins, the leader of the Black Unity League of Kentucky, one of the organizations that had co-sponsored the rally where the rebellion began, brought attention to the old schoolhouse in the Parkland area that was so dilapidated it was on the verge of collapse. Residents also voiced complaints about living conditions in general, an issue they had, of course, been organizing around for years. I'm not on welfare, an elderly Black woman explained to a reporter who she allowed into her decaying apartment. I work for a white man. I worked for him since 1932, and this is how I gotta live, with rats and bugs. I don't know when I'm gonna fall through this rotten floor. We pay $110 a month for this, and that's about $900 in today's dollars. One of the old woman's neighbors, a Black adult male, shared her sentiment. What we need to do is burn these shacks down. Ain't right that people should have to live like rats and dogs. Store owners also came under heavy criticism. Many of the young people who participated in the rebellion explained that the violence had been an expression of exasperation over what they called years of insensitivity by shopkeepers, as well as exploitation through the sales of inferior wares. One of the most egregious offenders of this practice was the mayor himself, who headed a family dry goods business and made his living by selling items from trucks and charging Black customers 30% more than white customers outside of the West End. Many of the participants specifically looted white-owned stores that operated under these racist practices, sparing those establishments that displayed the word soul brother or soul sister. But even more than the police, the dismal housing conditions, educational disparities, and discrimination within the commercial sphere, employment was the biggest concern among young people. They should give people jobs where people earn decent money and somewhere to spend the money, one young person said, pointing out the fact that the only jobs available were those paying $125 an hour, which is about $9 an hour today, jobs sweeping floors with no future and not substantial enough to support families. 16-year-old William Wade put it bluntly, we steal. We've got to steal to keep ourselves up. We have no jobs and no education. Although none of the complaints or demands made by the Black community were addressed, after the rebellion, many of the stores in the West End remained covered with plywood over their showcase windows. Police remained stationed in their patrol cars throughout the area. The lesson from the rebellion in Louisville and in thousands of other cities across the United States is that this form of protest was a consequence of the all too predictable presence of the police. Yet the decision to respond to the rebellions that were rooted in socioeconomic grievances with police force was not a foregone conclusion. Johnson's own advisory commission on civil disorders, known popularly as the Kerner Commission, offered a promising but unpursued alternative to the escalation of policing and incarceration. In its final report, released 3 months before the Louisville Rebellion in February 1968, a report that went on to become a national bestseller as a mass market paperback, the commission famously observed that the United States was moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal, and offered policy options to manage the problem of race relations. It recommended the creation of 2 million jobs for low-income Americans, continued federal intervention to ensure school desegregation, year-round schooling for low-income youths, the construction of hundreds of thousands of public housing units, and a guaranteed minimum income. As the commission warned federal policymakers and the nation, absent a massive infusion of public resources promoting greater access to political and economic institutions, quote, sufficient to make a dramatic, visible impact on life in the urban ghetto, a rising proportion of Negroes in disadvantaged city areas might come to look upon the deprivation and segregation they suffer as proper justification to engage in large-scale violence followed by white retaliation. The Kerner Commission's grim forecast came to fruition almost immediately and continues to shape American life. Federal policymakers did not heed the warnings of the Kerner Commission or take seriously what residents in Louisville and other cities told elected officials, newspaper reporters, and researchers about how rebellion could be prevented in the future. Nor did authorities take the persistence of rebellion as an indication that the strategy of increasing state surveillance and militarizing crime control forces in Black communities had inflamed the violence that officials wanted to prevent. Rebellions continued after 1972, although not with the frequency of those in Louisville and other cities in the immediate post-King era, further demonstrating that aggressive policing tends to incite violence, especially when residents are protesting the thing that they are then subjected to. The conditions that bred the police encounters and legal injustices that precipitated the rebellions 50 years ago and in the 80s and 90s and today would not have happened and could have been avoided entirely had national policymakers and law enforcement authorities decided to respond in a different way to the enlightened protests of the post-civil rights era in both its nonviolent and violent forms. The large-scale rebellions of the last decades of the 20th and early 21st century, Miami in 1980, Los Angeles in 1992, and Cincinnati in 2001, share many of the same causes and characteristics as the collective violence of the earlier period. But these rebellions and the political violence that followed beginning in the mid-2010s emerged in response to miscarriages of justice, like the acquittal of the 4 Los Angeles police officers who savagely beat Rodney King in the first viral police brutality video, an exceptional instance of police brutality, like the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by Ferguson police 8 days after he graduated high school. They emerged in response to the way policing measures advanced an inherently racist criminal legal system that disproportionately ensnared millions of women and men of color, deepening segregation and inequality in the process. Taken together, the history of this violence demonstrates that patrolling low-income neighborhoods with outside forces does not effectively control crime. In fact, it establishes a dynamic where residents and officers view each other as the enemy, rendering both sides less safe. Had policymakers and officials at all levels of government taken the rebellions as an opportunity to seriously listen to residents' demands, contend with underlying socioeconomic causes that Johnson's own Kerner Commission identified, and reconsider the purpose and function of police, the negative consequences of the punitive approach to urban problems might have been avoided entirely. The most important lesson from the rebellions that police violence precipitates community violence escaped policymakers and the scholars they consulted. Instead, led by the national government, authorities further criminalized entire communities where unrest materialized for the remainder of the 20th century and still today, allocating billions of taxpayer dollars into the wars on crime and drugs and gangs and mass incarceration that represent not only gross violations of civil liberty, but are arguably the biggest domestic policy failures in the history of the United States. The murder of Breonna Taylor in March 2020 by Louisville police is a legacy of the policy path sustained over 5 decades. As in the 1960s and early 1970s, both the nonviolent and violent protests of 2020 forced the question that has only grown more pressing about what kind of country the United States should be. Will the nation continue along the undemocratic and misguided policy path that has criminalized racially marginalized groups and the poorest among us for generations? Or will America finally fulfill the unfinished promises of the abolition of slavery and Jim Crow by supporting the structural transformations and redistributive changes at the national level that tens of millions of people demanded across the United States and the world during the summer of 2020? The most effective approaches to crime prevention involve programs that respond to community needs and grant control of public safety to residents, especially in areas where the government has failed. New investments into preschool programs, job creation measures, mental health treatment, college scholarships, decent affordable housing, and reconstituting the criminal justice system based on the principle of repair instead of retribution would make for a safer society and a stronger democracy. Police are the default response to violence and other crises in low-income communities of color, but community needs can and should be met by the people. We as a nation still fail to reckon with the history of Black rebellion and with the wisdom Martin Luther King Jr. prophetically offered toward the end of his life, that only social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. There is no other answer, he said. Constructive social change will bring certain tranquility. Evasions will merely encourage turmoil. More than a half century after King's insights, it is clear that America will continue to catch the fires of rebellion until the structures of racial inequality are finally dismantled and the police are no longer empowered by authorities to manage the material consequences of conditions that are beyond their control. Thank you.
Is my mic? Can you hear? Thank you, Dr. Hinton, for that wonderful lecture. We really, really appreciate the attention that you gave to Louisville, right? I mean, we read your book and we read about Cairo, we read about all of these other cities that you engaged throughout the history of the 1960s, but what we did not expect is a lecture that really centered the history of Louisville, that took us from the moment of the eruption of protest from Breonna Taylor back to the 1960s to give us a history of this place and the history of protest and activism, but also the history of police violence in this city, so that many of the students who are here with us will understand that we're not experiencing this for the first time. So we really, really appreciate the attention to detail that you gave us to the city of Louisville in your lecture. So thank you so much for what you gave us. I am joined here by my friend and colleague, Dr. Cherie Dawson Edwards, who is an associate professor of criminal justice and also the associate dean of diversity, engagement, culture, and climate. I have to work hard to get that acronym right, but I'm engaged with her, and she is going to help me to moderate the Q&A. We'll ask the first couple of questions, and then we'll kick it out to the floor for you all to be able to ask questions of Dr. Hinton, and then we will see if we can get into the chat and see if there are any questions in the chat for those who are joining us virtually. Dr. Dawson Edwards.
Yeah, so I don't even know where to start. First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you for the virtual audience as well. And Dr. Hinton, thank you so much for, like Dr. McCormick said, sharing the information, particularly about Louisville. I am from Louisville. I think a lot of people may not know that. So this is home for me, and you know, I think anybody that's been in Louisville for the past couple of years has really felt the weight of our city. One of the things that struck me, of course, I'm a criminal justice professor, so I talk about this stuff all the time, and I've been very grateful for the public education and knowledge that has come from what has happened in the last couple of years, so that I can share in public dialogue with all of you all constantly about the things that I've cared about and talked about and researched for, you know, for a couple of decades. But I want to take all the things that you said about the history of Louisville and Black rebellion and the police, and talk about, for instance, something that happened to me today. I happened to have been on a panel this morning with the current police chief. So I apologize to everybody who saw the news clips. It didn't necessarily go so well. I could do better, and I'm always trying to be better. So, so we have a new police chief since the onset of the 2020 protests. She continues to believe that the answer to the problems is that we need more Black police. In my field, you know, representative bureaucracy is debatable. In your book, you quote a Cincinnati resident who said the Black police are just as bad as the white police officers. So I guess my question to you are, what are your thoughts about our current chief who came to our city after the onset of the racial justice protests? What are your thoughts about the arguments that is at least one of the major answers to the problem is to hire more Black officers?
Yeah, and that's, that has been the answer historically. I mean, in this moment when all of this conflict between police and residents of color was happening in the 60s and 70s, the idea was, oh, well, we just need to diversify the force. We just need to hire more Black officers and these problems will be resolved. And they weren't, right? Because these problems are not about they go far beyond policing. They're rooted in larger conditions the Kerner Commission had identified. And as we know, as that beautiful quote from Cincinnati illustrates, I mean, Black police officers are still police officers. It doesn't fundamentally change the dynamics of policing. It doesn't fundamentally change the logics of policing, and that is identifying suspects, and removing people from the community in low-income communities of color and protecting property in white and middle-class communities. Whether you're Black, white, a woman, a man, brown, doesn't matter. If that's what your job is, that is the system that you're going to continue. So, and that you're going to proliferate in your work. So we're not going to be able to hire Black police officers as a way out of these fundamental problems. The questions are about the system of policing. The questions really in terms of meaningful change are thinking beyond the police to address many of the underlying issues that lead to crime and social harm in our communities.
Thank you for that. And if I can just do one follow-up question. So after I said something similar to her and not as eloquent as you, she looked at me down the panel and said, "Do you even like police?" What would be your response to that, Dr. Hinton? Because I know you're better than me at this. So what would you have said?
Well, I have to say, I'm sorry that this happened to you. What a day. What a day.
I'm used to it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not about, I mean, that's the thing, it's not about, It's not about the individual police officer. Again, it's about, it's not about liking police or not. It's about wanting to think about, like, well, what is actually going to foster safety in our community, and what are the underlying problems with police culture and with the fundamental objectives of policing that lead to problems that cannot be solved by simply diversifying. I mean, I think in general, part of the problem with representation is that, like, it fails to actually get at, what the root problems are, what the root inequalities are. It's a Band-Aid for something that needs a whole different set of approaches and investments to actually lead to meaningful and lasting change.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry that happened to you as well. Of course, the retort could always be to the force, do you even like Black people?
Well, that was my first, without filters,
no.
That's what I wanted to say. Do you like, it was a panel about police in schools. So I wanted to say, do you like Black kids?
Exactly.
But,
yeah. Oh, that's,
right.
That's
I mean, we could have multiple layers of this conversation. This chief has also advocated, and one of the more intriguing chapters of the book for me was your chapter on the schools. Right, and the way that so many things that were happening in the schools led to conflicts with the police and police being called in to patrol the schools. And so this chief has also called for more officers back in the schools after we have advocated to have them out of our schools, right? And so that's another level of the conversation that doesn't work either. But for your conversation is what does work is the investment in those things, right, that the community needs, and the community articulates this need and a greater investment in those things. And you trace that in your book in the history of Black communities organizing and saying, this is what we need. In response to rebellion, this is what we need. We need more community centers. We need more mental health. We need more, and the list goes on and on and on. And there will always be authorities who say, no, actually, we don't need that. What we need are more police. And they further invest in more police. And so it struck me in your talk that you talked about a 3,000% increase, right, in funding to police between, I think, 1965 and 1970. And so if it's 3,000% in those 5 years, imagine what it is in 2021. And so it's really important for me to have those numbers in mind when you start talking about contemporary discourses about defunding the police, because it'll come out as it's just some radical left-wing idea to defund the police, when what we're really talking about is a history of Black activists and organizers saying, this is what we need. Authorities saying, no, this is not what you need. In fact, we're going to increase the budgets of the police. And then when we say defund the police in order simply to divert those resources back to the community, it becomes, right, as if, again, you're anti-American, you're a radical left-wing, right, activist. And so I'm just curious if you'd speak a little bit more to that history of, right, increasing those funds in light of the conversation about defunding the police right now.
Yeah, it's such a important question. I mean, and that's really the thing. I mean, that's why, if you don't want to list that's why the Kerner Commission, I keep on coming back to this. I will keep on coming back to this, is so important, because, in the Louisville case, right, I laid out all of those quotes, those demands, those grievances that residents had expressed. Pointing to jobs, pointing to exploitation within the commercial sphere, pointing to real exploitation within housing, and really, like, inhumane housing conditions that should have been addressed. Even if all of those are ignored, right, you have this government task force saying what we need are investments in all of these other areas, in those very same areas, which are more cost effective. And instead of the job creation program for low-income Americans of color in the 1960s that the Kerner Commission had called for, and this is a presidential task force, we get a job creation program for police. And so, one of the really important stories here, one that I outline in my first book, is that, beginning in this moment in the late 60s, we get a real divestment from social welfare programs while simultaneously investing in police, which of course creates this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, given that, so much of the crime and social harm in our communities are rooted in these socioeconomic inequalities. And consistently throughout the 20th century, this investment from social welfare programs while simultaneously expanding police and surveillance and incarceration has defined domestic social policies, and there has been a real resistance on the part of policymakers to invest in community-based programs that are far more cost-effective. One of the big things that the body of my research shows is that these sets of investments into policing and incarceration have really failed to keep our most vulnerable communities safe. And I think now is the time, and this is really what I see calls for defund the police being about, to try a different set of approaches, a different mode of governance that is more cost effective and more humane, that seeks to make a different set of investments. And I think one of the and these these calls for reallocating resources, although not under the mantra of defund the police, are essentially what we've been hearing from Black communities throughout the 20th century. Within the nonviolent direct action protests, the civil rights movement, but also during moments of rebellion. It's really about divesting from crime control resources and investing into a different kind of model for public safety, one that is not so pie in the sky, one that, government officials themselves at the highest level of government and the Kerner Commission were saying, if we really want to deal with the problem of inequality in our society, these are the kinds of investments that we need to make. We've got to look beyond the police. The point that I ended my talk with, police really and prisons are there to manage the material consequences of inequality instead of actually just investing in communities. Police have become the short-term solution, or are the short-term solution that have become the reality for this country long-term.
Thank you. And with that, we'd like to open the Q&A up to the audience. And we have our GTA Barbie here, who is the mic on, who has a mic here and who will come to you. Rather than having a lot of folk in the aisle, if you have a question that you would like to pose to Dr. Hinton, just raise your hand and she'll come to you.
Of course you can.
Or maybe if you're in the far back, maybe you step out a meter. Maybe you meet her halfway. I don't know.
It's a long room.
It's a long run. We got Barbie getting her steps in today.
Hi. So recently, the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse has started in the Kenosha shootings, and the judge stated that the men that he killed cannot be called victims, but instead rioters and looters. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, wow. I wasn't aware of that. That's infuriating. I mean, the people who he killed are, again, peaceful protesters. Again, this reflects not only the kind of the monopoly on violence or the idea that police violence is always somehow justified or legitimate, but reflects the ways in which white extremist or white supremacist violence is also seen as legitimate, and any attempt to disrupt the racial status quo. Again, that Louisville open housing example, I think, is so important. Thinking historically, whether nonviolent or nonviolent is always seen as criminal, is always seen as rioting. I mean, that's really unfortunate and very disrespectful to the young men who lost their lives at Rittenhouse's hands and their families. I mean, Rittenhouse himself, and again, this speaks to the deeply inherently racist nature of policing, right? Rittenhouse was carrying a military-grade rifle and walked past police with his arms up, and police didn't stop to arrest him. But they were arresting peaceful protesters for racial justice. So in many ways, that says it right there. Who is allowed to exercise violence and against whom, and who is allowed to exercise their First Amendment rights in this country and for what.
Some questions to the back.
Excuse me.
One thing that's often missed in discussions, I think, is the intersection for people who have mental disabilities and people who are LGBT, especially trans women, and how they are oftentimes the most vulnerable from police violence. How has your research, or has it much touched on kind of that intersection of identity, particularly the vulnerability for people with mental disabilities and people of color?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing that's really important too in thinking about kind of the historical landscape of this, I was talking about the disinvestment from social welfare programs that we really see beginning in the post-civil rights period, and by the 1980s, it's no coincidence that the closure of many mental health facilities and programs for people with health conditions end up closing, and we see the simultaneous rise of the prison system, right? So, many people are serving time for health issues that have nothing to do with crime, but that have to do with the way that policymakers decide to treat public health issues and target certain populations.
And while she's walking over there, I just want everybody to know that I have my computer up because I'm looking at the chat. I'm not like working. So if there's someone virtually who wants to ask a question, I'm trying to make sure we capture that.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned a lot of community-based solutions and using those instead of policing. How do we ensure that those solutions don't replicate the same systems of harm that exist in our police forces right now?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. I think one thing that the criminal justice reform movement has shown us, right, is that reforms can often lead to more even more insidious practices. I mean, I think one way that has never truly been tried in the United States is to really cede power and authority over public safety to communities. I mean, right now we do know that some community-based violence interruption programs really that are far more cost effective than gang task forces have profound impact in communities that are vulnerable to violence. I mean, one of my favorite programs is Advanced Peace. It's based out of Richmond, California, but it's now expanded across the country. And essentially, Advanced Peace empowers older men who have been involved in gun violence, who have served time, to act as first responders and to work with young men and women who are vulnerable to getting to shooting others or to getting shot themselves. They give these young people love and resources and mentorship and support and jobs to actually make a real dent on gun violence. And actually, President Biden, there are many things that are not promising about his criminal justice reform policies, but did mention the work of Advanced Peace in his major speech on gun violence. So I think and unfortunately, historically, many of these community-based solutions have been severely underfunded and are often not given the support they need to really grow and flourish. And so I think we do know that the current approach has not worked, and so now it's time to try different solutions. And one of them should be, empowering those who are closest to these problems to address the issues on their own terms.
As mentioned earlier, you suggest in your book that historically schools have acted as a catalyst for the issues that lead to police brutality. Moving forward, how do you believe that schooling and education can be a part of the solution to these issues?
Yeah, so that's such an important question. In many ways, education is really key, right? Because it's going to take a major educational campaign in order to build the political will and build coalitions that will lead to bringing about the kind of major policy changes that I'm talking about. I mean, if we are going to to reconceive public safety and think beyond the police and invest in the kind of community programs I'm talking about, especially given, the resistance that we've seen in spite of, the unprecedented protests in 2020 to rethinking policing. We've really seen, following a larger historical pattern, policymakers doubling down, liberal and conservative policymakers alike, saying, really distancing themselves from that idea. Education is going to be super important, and I think that's exactly why we're seeing this this backlash against what is called critical race theory, but is essentially the history of this country that is built on economic and political and social oppression and exploitation of marginalized groups. So the kind of history wars and education is at the center, I think, of all of this. With respect to policing itself in public schools, I don't think, again, you don't see the kind of school resource officer or disciplinary measures being taken in schools in well-resourced schools that tend to be white and middle-class communities. So I think one of the things that we need to do is begin to invest in robust, again, I'm going to go back to what the Kerner Commission called for, an overhaul of public schools. That will invest resources in those schools so that children can thrive, instead of investing resources in school resource officers that essentially, establish what is called the pipeline from many under-resourced schools in vulnerable communities with high rates of reported crime and violence to prison. So there should be, I'd like to see some of the major school police forces also be divested from, so that we can build a society where, a uniformed officer with a gun doesn't need to be on a school campus or isn't on a school campus.
Hello, Dr. Hinton. It's an honor, and thank you for addressing us today. So I have a question about philanthropic organizations and how you feel that we always say that metro government plays a role, but where should capital be deployed and or advocacy efforts from philanthropy in the community? And a follow-up question is, when we address public safety, but particularly root cause, do you have ideas of where capital can be deployed to address root cause that ultimately stems to violence in community?
So the philanthropy question is a really great one. And right now, I think some of the most exciting programs and approaches to fostering public safety in communities are happening at the grassroots level. And many of these programs are being funded by nonprofits and philanthropic organizations. I think one of the things that I'd like to see, and that's where these organizations get their lifeblood. And I think it's really important that that these community-based programs get government funding, get federal funding, and are eventually funded at scale, at some of, at the same scale as law enforcement programs. There's a really, there's a precedent for this going back to the 60s, not the Kerner Commission this time, but during the first year of the war on poverty, there was a principal within the Office of Economic Opportunity for community action programs that was called maximum feasible participation. And essentially from 1964 to 65, the federal government was granting local organizations tens of millions of dollars directly under the idea that, what we've been talking about, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, that poor people know best how to solve the issues in their communities. And local officials really didn't like this. They thought that, the federal government was ceding too much power to the grassroots, and this kind of exciting and robust grant structure to grassroots organizations was never to return again in domestic policy. And so I think while philanthropy is important, I think the government too has an important role to play. And then in terms of capital and addressing root causes, I think so much of these problems are rooted in employment issues, are rooted in education and employment issues. And so I think, we need a major job creation program of well-paying jobs that will enable people to support families and live comfortably in a way that that many American families have not since the 1960s and with the decline of domestic manufacturing. So I really think jobs are really key. And then with that, education. I mean, college education should be something that's free. As it is in many nations in Western Europe. Everybody should have the opportunity to attend college if that's what they want to do. Everybody should have the opportunity to find meaningful employment that allows them to thrive and allows them to support their family comfortably and live a decent life. To me, those are the most important things.
So there's a question in the chat that you kind of started touching on, talking about grassroots, but specifically it says, thanks, Dr. Hinton. How does community organizing fit into the picture you've depicted for us?
Oh, well, I mean, community organizing is key. And that's what the freedom movement teaches us. I mean, I think that's one thing that we often forget. I know I'm like talking really broad and big picture and about these big structural changes, but actually with the political education question, I mean, what's going to be so key to bringing about the kind of changes that I think so many of us want to see is consistent organizing. And we know that, that takes time, that takes dedication, that takes patience, that takes a lot of sleepless nights. It's not something that just, happens out of thin air, but it's that kind of organizing and building social movements and building coalitions that's going to put the necessary pressure on elected officials to make the kind of changes that we want to see. So, none of this is possible without that, without organizations and organizers and activists, staying on the ground and continuing to build.
All right, we're getting close to 8, so I think we have time for maybe 1, maybe 2 more questions here from the floor. And then I just want to remind everyone, you should have already gotten a link. We usually have, the ABI has on the morning after the lecture, a community breakfast, which is a research meets activism breakfast that's typically in the community that brings a panel of activists together to talk about the subject of the lecture. And then the lecturer would provide closing remarks. We will do that virtually this year in COVID, but you should all have a link to that. And we have, and just quickly, we have two of our, so Dr. Dawson Edwards will be on the panel, but also Antonio Taylor is here with us, and also Stacey Bussey is here with us. They are both on the Community Civilian Review Board of the police here in Louisville. And so they will engage us in conversation tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. on Teams. You should have the link. And Dr. Hinton will engage us at the end of that. So there will be other opportunities to engage. But this may be the last or second to last question that we have time for this evening.
Oh, I feel the pressure. Hi, Dr. Hinton. Thank you so much for the presentation and also for making it so Louisville specific. Like Dr. Dawson Edwards, I'm also from Louisville, so I was very moved seeing all of those pictures of my hometown's history. That was great. My question for you, and this can either be your opinion as a person or from your research, but I'm very curious, as somebody who works in criminal justice policy advocacy across the state, when I was listening to your presentation talking about the factors that Black communities have suffered that enable what happens, that foster these conditions and the antagonism and responses, I was struck by how similar a lot of those conditions are to white communities. So we know, even though it's important to talk about how these are disproportionately affecting Black communities, and I myself am from West Louisville, so I understand these things, but also the poverty and all of these conditions, and also the criminalizing, the surveillance of drugs, and all of these things are happening in predominantly rural America. So they're not just Black issues. And so I'm curious to know your thoughts on why we're seeing these kinds of responses more in urban areas. I can kind of guess, but I'm wondering, do you think it's just the racial dynamics at play, or is there other political and geographical factors, especially because we know in the past, too, in the 20th century, there was this antagonistic relationship between policing and white communities, and were responses, especially when you think about union and labor dynamics and all these things, and I wonder what happened to it. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a great question and a really complicated one. I mean, I think part of it has to do both with the kind of the history of racist enforcement in the U.S. I think it has to do with the political organizing and mobilizing that has historically emerged in Black communities, and the in many ways, the way that policing itself is tied to very specifically, and in many ways, a legacy of the history of racial oppression. I mean, I think, as and whether, regardless of what color you are as a police officer, most police officers in low-income communities of color do not live in those communities. They live outside the communities. They're coming into communities in full uniform with a gun, and in many ways, these groups of outsiders, as James Baldwin called them, an occupying army, carried forth the legacy of the mob violence that I described in the talk that characterized white supremacist terrorism in Black communities specifically throughout much of the 20th century. So I think part of it might have to do with the really different histories of policing and police brutality in Black and white communities. But I think one of the things that's so unfortunate is that we have far much more in common than that which divides us, and in failing to see those commonalities and exploiting those divisions, I think many political and economic elites and the media have really prevented us from recognizing all that we share and the common conditions and experiences that are shared among poor Black people in urban areas and poor white people in rural areas. And I think certainly, especially once you get to the 80s and 90s, many of the policing strategies that had been used in urban centers in the immediate post-civil rights period, we see increasingly as the war on drugs unfold being used in rural communities. So, part of that larger education campaign that we've been talking about is really kind of building that awareness of of the common conditions that we do share and the institutions that maintain inequalities in general in this country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hinton. I think we really are at time here at 7:58. We thank you for a brilliant lecture. We thank you for your time and a very engaging Q&A. We're so glad that you were able to be here with us as our 15th annual Anne Braden Institute lecturer. And we look forward to engaging you again in the morning with Dr. Dawson Edwards, with Antonia Taylor, with Stacia Bussey, who will talk about local activist issues around what's been happening in the contemporary moment in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor and other organizing and activist issues in Louisville. So we look forward to that conversation. Again, please join us. You should all have the link. And we look forward to staying in conversation with you. Thank you so much for showing up, for being out here tonight with the Anne Braden Institute. And we look forward to staying in conversation with you. Thank you so much. All right. God bless you. Good night. Thank you so much.